Hello everybody, this is David. Welcome back to my channel. This is the next video in our series, Where Did the Bible Come From? And in the last video we looked at the manuscripts, the Hebrew manuscripts that made up the Old Testament, and we looked at some people called the Masorettes, from where we get the Masoretic text from, which is the foundation of our Bibles today. Now, at the end of the last video, I said we were going to look at the texts and manuscripts of the New Testament, but I've just come across some amazing information from the British and Foreign Bible Society. I came across an article regarding the Masorettes and the punctuation of Biblical Hebrew. And I wanted to share this article now. I'm basically going to be quoting from the article, parts of it, and I'm going to be putting a link to that article in the description of the video. And it is a fascinating article. It really and truly is. I'm so happy that I found it, and I'm so happy that I'm able to share it with you as part of this series. So if you're ready, then let's have a go. And the title of the article is called The Masorettes and the Punctuation of Biblical Hebrew. Now, Biblical Hebrew was the first classical language to be systematically punctuated. By a classical language, we mean an ancient language that was used in the ancient world. Now, in comparison with modern languages, the system was very complex. There are more commonly used punctuation marks in Hebrew than there are letters in the English alphabet, and they are applied not only between phrases but to virtually every word of the scriptures, indicating very precisely each word's relationship with others in a phrase, as well as dividing each sentence into hierarchically ordered word groups. Now, this complexity, coupled with sometimes substantial orthographic variations between printed editions, has led many students of the language to neglect Hebrew punctuation entirely. I wonder why that is, because it's quite difficult. It takes a lot of thinking about. But with the advent of computer typesetting, and in particular the inclusion of these marks in the magnetic text of, for example, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, that challenges scholars in linguistics and computation to cooperate in a more detailed analysis of this punctuation than has ever before been possible. But even without further research, it provides the opportunity to analyze the logical structure of the Hebrew text by computer and to apply the results to Bible translation and to translation checking. Thank God for technology, eh? Where would we be without computers? So let's have a look at briefly the historical background. Firstly, let's look at the development of punctuation in the West. Now, in general, ancient languages were not punctuated. In some Egyptian poetic texts, line and stanza marks exist as aids to the reader, and some early Greek inscriptions use a vertical ellipsis as a phrase or sentence divider. But the only punctuation apparently known to Aristotle was the paragraphos, an underscore to indicate the beginning of a new topic. Now, the invention of punctuation to mark the grammatical or logical structure of texts is generally attributed to Aristophanes of Byzantium. Now, as chief librarian of Alexandria around 195 AD, Aristophanes, these Greek names are so hard to say, was responsible for copying and annotating many works from classical Greek literature. In doing so, he added breathings and accents and devised a simple three-part system of punctuation by which a text was divided by dots placed at the end of words, a short clause, a comma, had a dot in the middle, a phrase, colon, at the bottom, and a sentence, periodos, at the top. Now, in spite of its obvious advantages, this system was scarcely used after Aristophanes, except to clarify a few obscure poetic texts. Now, Latin inscriptions, unlike Greek ones, marked word divisions by a small dot. At the beginning of what's known as the Common Era, in other words, from the year AD 33 after Christ, AD in other words, these points were also used in books and a paragraph system similar to that of Greek, which came into being. A new subject was introduced by starting a new line and changing the indentation, much as in modern European languages, except that instead of being indented, the line was extended into the left margin as a hanging paragraph. Now, this practice was particularly used in texts which were composed to be read aloud in public. Cicero used it to mark natural breaks in his Latin orations, as had Demosthenes in Greek. I told you these guys' names were hard to say, and was comparatively short-lived in spite of occasional attempts to revive Aristophanes' system for Latin, most notably by Aelius Donatus, who was Jerome's tutor. We know who Jerome was. From the 4th century to the 9th, the only consistently punctuated extant Latin text, that is, existing text, and that just by paragraphos, is Jerome's Vulgate. Now, I mentioned that particular writing in my last video. So it was only under the influence of Charlemagne, who's a very interesting character in himself. I might have to do a video on him at some point. It's only under the influence of Charlemagne in the 9th century that punctuation systems developed in Western Europe. By this time, the churches were beginning to use neumes as an early musical notation for chanting, and some of these, along with Aristophanes, comma, and periodos, were gradually added to the punctuation schema, notably the punctus elevatus and the punctus interrogativus. These Greek words. These had a dual function. They indicated both a change of pitch and a grammatical nuance. Although this system was fully developed by the 12th century, it was largely confined to chanting, and it was not until after the invention of printing that it was consistently used. Now, in the work of Caxton, now we know about the Caxton Press, there is no very clear relationship between punctuation and syntax. The consistent modern use of punctuation in the service of clarity dates back only to the 15th century, probably to the Venetian printer Aldus Manutius around 1515, or possibly to his grandson of the same name. Let's look now at punctuation in Hebrew. Masoretic Hebrew punctuation is similar to that based on the neumes, in that it is very closely related to the musical pitch used in incantation. It is different in two major respects. On the one hand, it is far more comprehensive, and on the other, it became a norm for all Jews who read their scriptures as soon as it was introduced. Both of these differences were caused by political, religious, social, and economic forces, which culminated in the appearance of the Masoretic text in the 10th century. Let's look at the Jewish academies, the Mishnah and Talmud. After the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70 by the Romans, Galilee became the administrative center of Judaism. The Sanhedrin moved to the new city of Tiberias, and the Jewish religious academies called yeshivot moved from Jerusalem to Tiberias and Caesarea. These academies served two purposes. They were centers for training rabbis in what were to become known as the Mikra, that is, the written scriptural law, and the oral teachings of the great scholars, the Mishnah, that is, repeated from memory. They were also institutes of advanced scholarships where highly trained rabbis working under the direction of an officially appointed scholar called the Nasi, literally prince, devoted themselves to producing a unified and normative interpretation of the oral law. The first fruits of this study were the Tractates of the Mishnah, which appeared in the 3rd century AD, under the direction of Judah Hanasi. Now these were almost entirely produced in the academy at Tiberias. Meanwhile, similar academies had been established in Sura and Nehadia in Babylon, as I mentioned in my last video. The Babylonian academies were placed under the direct control of the Reshgulata, that is, head of exile, or exiliarch, a fact which was later to have serious repercussions. The quality of scholarship produced by the Tiberian and Babylonian academies can scarcely be overstated. In them, thousands of students were trained rigorously for many years, and those who graduated and left the academies were required to return twice a year for a month's refresher course called Kala, that is, completion of study. Now there was comparatively free movement and therefore exchange of information between the academies. Now that Mishnah was regarded as virtually canonical, scholars from the academies in both Palestine, that is modern-day Israel, and Babylon undertook the task of expanding it to include all the main teachings of the greatest Jewish scholars. Now this was a work completed in the 5th century. This expansion, called the Gemara, which is another word for completion, took different forms in Tiberias and Sura. Palestine fell under the control of Constantinople, and persecution under successive Christian emperors severely disrupted Jewish learning there. But Judaism continued to flourish in Babylon. Now it's probably for this reason that the Palestinian Gemara is much shorter than the Babylonian one, only about a third of its length, and it does not cover all the tractates of Mishnah. The Mishnah and the Gemara, together with some further writing from the Talmud, that is learning, the Babylonian recension is called the Talmud Bavli, or Babylonian Talmud, as opposed to the inappropriate named Talmud Yerushalmi, or Jerusalem Talmud. Inappropriate in that it wasn't written in Jerusalem, it was written in Tiberias. So it should be stressed that from a rabbinic perspective, the oral law of Mishnah and Gemara, although assembled in the academies over centuries, was no less authoritative than the Mikra. Like the text of the Torah, it had been given as a promise by Moses. Now, a rabbinic exegesis of Exodus chapter 24 verse 12 says that the tables are the Decalogue, that is, the speech of God. The law is the scripture. The commandment is the Mishnah. The that I have written is the prophets and writings, and to teach them is the Gemara. So telling us that all of these things were given to Moses from Sinai. Let's look now from the Talmud to the Masoretic text. The Torah, or Pentateuch, had long been the pivot of the Jewish scriptures, and as such had been transmitted with the utmost care, as I mentioned in my last video. The rest of the scriptures, the prophets and the writings, had not been so scrupulously preserved. It was not until the Synod of Jamnia in the last decade of the 1st century AD that final agreement was reached on the canon of the Jewish scriptures, and by that time several different Hebrew and Aramaic texts were in circulation. Although the Academies had attempted to produce an agreed text, it was not until a consensus of interpretation was reached that the rabbis were able to decide on a definitive text of the whole of Scripture. Now, the Talmud was the embodiment of this consensus. But between the compilation of the Mishnah and that of the Gemara, the language of the Jews in Palestine had changed. The Mishnah is written in Hebrew, not the Hebrew of the scriptures, but a relatively similar language. It's sometimes asserted that Hebrew had been replaced by Aramaic as a spoken language before the what's known as the Common Era in the Church Age from AD 30 onwards. But this is not true. The Jewish revolutionary Bar Kokhba wrote letters to his family and friends, some in Aramaic and some in Hebrew, between the years 132 AD and 135 AD. Now, there is at least a possibility that even in the 3rd century AD, the language of the Mishnah was spoken by ordinary people, and not just by Hebrew scholars. But the Gemara is written in Aramaic, so that it's clear that by the 5th century, both biblical and Mishnaic Hebrew were dead languages, known only to scholars. Now, of course, Hebrew continued to be taught at a time when only a few highly educated Europeans could read and write. The Jewish educational system was very advanced. The education of male children was a religious obligation, and primary schools existed in all towns and many villages. Boys started learning scripture by the age of 6. Several went on to study Mishnah by 10, and the most able studied Talmud by the age of 14. But of every 1,000 boys who started school, only one could be expected to become a proficient scholar. If the scriptures were to survive, new types of help to readers needed to be devised. Now, the earliest Hebrew manuscripts, in common with many ancient languages, had no punctuation system, except for starting a new line to indicate a new topic. And Hebrew had no vowels in its alphabet. Neither of these omissions was important as long as Hebrew was a spoken language. Cases where a vowel could readily be mistaken were to some extent catered for at an early period by inserting consonants to help the reader. For example, H for an A sound, Y for E, or I and W for U, although many ambiguities remained. Now, full stops were inserted to divide the text into sentences or verses, possibly as early as the 2nd century AD, and most verses were marked to indicate the most important pause to make when reading aloud. Before the Talmud was completed, the rabbis had amended these for consistency and added other marks to clarify the text. A vertical bar was written between the words when it was felt necessary to clarify where one ended and another began. Interword spaces were not regularly used, and stress markers were inserted. In Hebrew, most words are stressed on either the last or the last but one syllable. A very small number are stressed on the last but two, and several longer words also have a secondary tone, and it is very important to know where this stress is placed. No wonder not many people study this language. These tasks had been completed and agreed upon by the 6th century. Now, unfortunately, no manuscripts from this period have survived, but we know from later writers that a Codex Hilleli, ascribed to Rabbi Hillel ben Moses ben Hillel around the year 600 AD, and a Codex Muga were regarded as authoritative. Now, after some 500 years of scholarly labour, a definitive text of the Hebrew Bible had at last been produced. Now, that should have been the end of the Academy's work, but the demise of Hebrew as a spoken language provided a new challenge. Without vowels in the text, it was very hard, perhaps impossible, for anyone other than a rabbi to understand the scripture or pronounce it correctly. A system of vocalization had to be made, and since the text itself was now regarded as definitive, it had to be inserted without making changes to the letters in the text. To achieve this, the rabbis began to devise a system of dots to represent the different vowels. The Hebrew word for a dot or spot is nikud. It is the word used to describe Joseph's speckled cattle in the book of Genesis, chapter 30, verse 39. A related and very similar word, noked, means a shepherd, and we can imagine a typically rabbinic pun that the dot is a shepherd to guide the reader. Now, because the task of the rabbis from the 6th century onwards was no longer to establish a consensus, but to clarify and preserve the traditions which had already been agreed in the Academies, they are usually referred to as the Masorettes, that is, traditionalists. Pointed text, that is, text with all the vowels represented by dots, first came into existence in Tiberias in the 6th century. But this earliest form of pointing, sometimes called the Proto-Palestinian nikud, was complex and took different forms in different academies. During the 6th and 7th centuries, AD that is, the Babylonian rabbis developed a similar and more coordinated system. The Nikud Bavli, with vowel points placed over the consonants, while those at Tiberias began to produce a different system which placed the vowels predominantly under the consonants. This Tiberian Nikud eventually came to dominate and is the basis of what we now call the Masoretic pointing. Now, by the 8th or 9th century, the aims of rabbis and Masorettes had apparently been achieved. There was full consensus among rabbinic scholars on the text of all the scriptures and its correct interpretation. The 9th century, however, saw the rise of several threats to the traditions of Judaism, threats which substantially changed the perceived role of the Masorettes. Although at this time classical Greek literature was unknown in Europe, with perhaps the sole exception of the Irish monasteries, it had long been kept alive under the Caliphate, that is, the Muslim Caliphate. By the 9th century, it was being circulated in Arabic translation. Jewish communities were becoming increasingly urbanized, and Arabic was an everyday language of trade in towns and cities. Tiberias itself, which had fallen under Byzantine control, was taken by the Arabs in 636. Greek philosophical ideas, in particular Aristotelian, Platonic, and the Neoplatonist philosophy, became increasingly popular, and in many cases eroded the ancient Hebrew traditions. Many Jews were attracted to Gnosticism, and works such as the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation, which claimed to be written by Abraham himself, came to be widely circulated, retelling the biblical creation accounts in Neoplatonist or Gnostic terms. Among many of the new urban elite, Aristotelian ethics challenged traditional Jewish beliefs. A Persian Jew, Hivi al-Balkhi, who had converted to Gnosticism, even produced an expurgated text of scripture from which all offensive, in inverted commas, material had been removed. Now, a very different but equally problematic movement from the rabbinic point of view was the fast-growing Karaite sect. The office of Resh Guluta, exiliarch in Babylon, had developed into a hereditary one, but succession to it depended on the ascent of the Caliph. In the second half of the 8th century, the ruling Caliph refused to confirm the succession of Anan ben David, choosing instead his younger brother. Now, Anan's reaction was to set up a new, inverted commas, religion, which he claimed was a compromise between Judaism and Islam. His Sefer HaMikvot, that is, Book of Precepts, written in about 770 AD, asserted the full authority of the Hebrew Bible, but rejected both the Talmud and the authority of the rabbinate in the interpretation of Scripture, which was held to be self-evident to all readers. In stressing this principle, his followers, at first called Ananites, adopted the name Karaites, properly Quarites from the Hebrew verb to read. These Bible readers coined the term rabbinites for those who followed the authority of the Talmud. By the mid-9th century of the Karaites, under the leadership of Daniel al-Qumisi, had spread from Babylon to Palestine and attracted a considerable following there. Now, given the very real possibility that large numbers of Jews would read and interpret the Bible without reference to rabbinic orthodoxy, one final task remained for the Rabbinate Masorettes, that is, to restrict the number of ways in which the Bible could be interpreted by imposing upon it a system of punctuation which was so precise as to be, in almost all cases, totally unambiguous. In other words, you couldn't make it say what you wanted it to say. It's a common problem today. People do that with the Bible today. They make it say what they want it to say. Now, the method they adopted was an ingenious blend of ancient tradition with new technology. We have noted that major divisions within verses had been established for at least 1,000 years, and in general these were followed by the Masorettes, although some were revised in the interest of greater consistency. A musical tradition for intoning the scriptures had also been established, although it's not known how long this had existed in a stable form. In following these two systems, the Masorettes were indeed traditionalists. Their innovation was to complete the punctuation of verses in a rigorously mathematical way. I think we'll stop the video here and we'll come back for part 2 of this section in another video. So I want to thank you for joining me, See you shortly.